Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm discussing what I feel were the worst CPU and GPU purchases of 2017. Now some of these were just bad from the get-go, while others started life as viable options that sadly proved poor choices before year's end. So let's get into it. Kickstarting 2017, Intel released the new Kaby Lake series, which actually didn't turn out to be all that new at all. Apart from a small factory overclock, these were basically Skylake parts, and when matched clock for clock, we found zero IPC gains. So if you owned 2015 6700K, there really was no need to buy the 7700K, which was a shame because the same could be said if you owned either a Haswell or Broadwell Core i7 CPU, and arguably the same could also be said if you had a Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge Core i7. Still, if you were coming from an AMD FX series CPU or maybe a Core i5, something along those lines, then the 7700K offered noteworthy gains for those rocking a higher end graphics card, and it was therefore quite a viable option. Unfortunately, those that invested $340 US in a 7700K ended up getting completely hosed by Intel. There's really no other way to put it. Less than 9 months later, for almost the same price, Intel released the 8700K, which is essentially the same CPU, but with 50% more cores and threads. The 7700K is still a very capable gaming CPU, but the 8700K will no doubt prove to be a significantly better investment down the track. I should also note that while I am focusing all my attention on the 7700K, the same can really be said for all the Kaby Lake Core i7, Core i5, and Core i3 CPUs. They've all been heavily upgraded with the arrival of Coffee Lake. The only CPU that still remains a worthy investment is the G4560, and there really is nothing better for $100 even today. That said though, I would probably recommend you guys go and stretch that budget a little bit for the Core i3 8100. That would be a much smarter choice now. Anyway, if you bought a 7700K in the first quarter of 2017, you're probably not too upset. That said though, those seeking the ultimate gaming CPU midway through the year and ended up pulling the trigger on Intel's quad-core CPU, those people will be quite livid. Not only has the 7700K's resale value completely plummeted after the release of the 8700K, but you can't even upgrade to the 8700K from the 7700K without a motherboard change. And well, that brings me to part 2 of the Intel roll job. This really is a continuation of the Kaby Lake CPUs, but it has to be said, compounding the issue is Intel's crazy decision to remove backwards compatibility for the new Coffee Lake CPUs. Despite using the same LJ1151 socket, Intel's decided that the configuration needs to be changed, and therefore 8th gen CPUs won't work with 100 or 200 series motherboards, while Skylake and Kaby Lake CPUs also won't work on new 300 series boards. Whether or not it was absolutely necessary for Intel to eliminate compatibility here, I honestly don't know. I can just tell you that from a consumer's point of view, it is a massive inconvenience. If I had to guess, I'd say there's really no legitimate reason why Intel's had to drop or has dropped support for the 200 series motherboards. I said this even before reviewing the Coffee Lake CPUs, and quite a few Intel fans did shoot me down on that one. However, not that long ago, BitTech interviewed the product manager for ROG motherboards at ASUS, that's Andrew Wu, and he said a few interesting things. When asked if Intel let them, could they make Z270 motherboards compatible with 8th gen core processors, Andrew said yes. It would require a BIOS update, but Intel somehow locked compatibility. In the end, this means those who invested in a 200 series motherboard this year are now at the end of the road. Those Core i7 7700K owners are now faced with having to ditch not just their CPU, but also their shiny new Z270 motherboard if they want to upgrade to a 6-core CPU. Truth be told, right now, the move from the 7700K to the 8700K isn't worth the investment, even if it was supported or possible on the same platform. That said, the option to make this upgrade in a year or so's time, well, that would probably be very welcomed by Intel customers. Anyone who spent $200 plus on a Z270 motherboard will surely be upset with Intel's decision here. Moving on, if you're a Core i7 7700K owner and you feel robbed, well then, can we please have a moment's silence for anyone who bought a Core i7-7800X? With Ryzen already out and about before the arrival of the Skylake X range, there seemed to be little point in buying the Core i7-7820X, and in particular the 6-core 7800X. Priced at $390 US, the 7800X was a step up from the 7700K for productivity workloads, no doubt about that. It was a bit of a step back for gaming, but it's more of a productivity platform, so that wasn't a big issue, but it was very poor value when positioned next to the Ryzen 7 1700. Still, those that bought in the last 4 months, well, they knew what they were getting, and they knew what the alternatives were, and they purchased anyway. What they didn't know, though, was that the 8700K would come along for basically the same price and offers the same amount of cores and threads while supporting much higher operating frequencies and more level 3 cache, along with what is, in my opinion, a superior method of connecting 10 or less cores, and that is, of course, to use the ring bus. The 8700K is also supported by significantly cheaper motherboards. The cheapest Z370 board, for example, is about half the price of the cheapest X299 board. In fact, the only real advantage of the 7800X would be those extra PCIe lanes, but if you want PCIe lanes, I'd probably just skip Skylake X altogether and get yourself a Threadripper CPU. Oh, and it also has quad channel memory, let's not forget about that, but based on my own productivity benchmarks, the 8700K schools the 7800K out of the box and went overclocked, so that extra memory bandwidth isn't coming in handy there. I suppose the only saving grace for the 7800X is the upgrade path. I suppose if you save $10 each week in just under 4 years, you'll be able to get yourself an 18-core 7980XE. Maybe 3 years if the second-hand market's kind. Now for the GPUs. Last year was a mega year for GPU releases. The GeForce 10 series was mighty impressive in terms of performance per watt, and AMD at least made the mid-range stuff, or the mid-range to low-end segment, interesting, let's say. 2017 has been more of a mixed bag. I think it's fair to say that the GTX 1080 Ti was an exciting product, very impressive launch, and many appreciated the fact that it did knock the GTX 1080 down to $500 US. From AMD, though, I think it's fair to say that the Radeon refresh was a pretty meh affair. It did bring more competitive pricing, at least initially, very initially. Vega was pretty much another shoulder shrug from AMD, though Vega 56 looks somewhat promising, and the recent Vega performance in new titles has been decent. The big problem for AMD, and even Nvidia to a certain degree, has been pricing and availability, thanks to an extreme demand from cryptocurrency miners, which has kept up now for about 5 months. So if you bought a Radeon graphics card in the last few months, chances are you paid too much. Heavily overpaid, in fact, and some will no doubt have been caught out by these price hikes. Despite offering a strong bang for your buck at the MSRP, AMD's Radeon GPUs have turned out to be one of the worst buys of 2017 for PC gamers. That's pretty much for the simple fact that you can't buy them anywhere near the MSRP, and even buying one at an inflated price has been quite challenging. That said, though, I was almost going to pull this little segment from this video because as I was putting it together, I did notice that Vega 56 is starting to sell at the MSRP. It was previously $500 or more, and I am seeing quite a few examples now selling for $400 US, and availability seems to be improving, or at least matching demand. So prices are starting to normalize. So, yeah. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that for quite a few months there you were getting steamrolled if you bought an AMD card, so I guess it's still valid to a certain degree. The next AMD item on the list are those X-rated CPUs. Like Intel's too hot for TV range, most of the X models don't really make a whole lot of sense. That said, though, I should note, as was the case with the GPUs, when I initially put this video together, the Ryzen 7 1800X was selling for $450 and the 1700X was selling for $360, and in the US at least they are now on sale for much more affordable prices, so it does make them a little less ridiculous. But anyway, in my opinion, the Ryzen 7 1800X is still the biggest waste of money. AMD set the MSRP at $500 US, which makes no sense at all. Today it can be found, though, selling for as little as $400 at least when on sale. The 1700X, which is essentially the same CPU anyway, can be had for $300 right now, so again, there's still even with the sale prices, no point paying $100 more for an 1800X when you can get the same CPU for $100 less. And then it is kind of hard to say, well, buy the 1700X because it is only slightly more than the 1700, but the 1700 you get a box cooler. So you're getting a box cooler included and you're getting to keep $15 of your own money. So yeah, I can't really think of any real genuine reason why someone would spend more money on these X chips, even if they were binned, but they still don't guarantee a 4 GHz overclock. And I've tested quite a few retail 1800X chips now, and 4 1700 chips, and I've found that all of them hit 4 GHz, and they did work with DDR4 3200 memory. Of course, though, overclocking your Ryzen CPU to 4 GHz is far from guaranteed, as I said, but I've found that you have just as much luck with the cheap bargain basement models as you do the expensive X models, so I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. The Ryzen 5 1600 isn't as bad in my opinion. It only costs a little over 10% more than the non-X version, but again, you're paying 10% more for the same CPU while foregoing the included cooler, and again, I'm not sure why you would do that. The 1500X in my opinion is also a bit pointless because it's priced so close to the R5 1600, and that's a much better CPU. The 1600 offers 50% more cores for a mere 13% increase, I think it is, in price. The extra L3 cache of the 1500X over the 1400 really is a little advantage as well. With even a mid-range to high-end graphics card, you'll see no real gains in games when they're clocked at the same frequency. Finally, the Ryzen Threadripper 1900X. And this is more of a niche product. It's not completely useless, but if you're going to jump on the X399 platform, just cough up the extra dough for the 1950X. It's a serious bargain now as well, $880 US. In summary, I wouldn't say that the X models are absolutely terrible buys or anything like. They just don't really make that much sense. It's certainly not like what we saw with the 7700K where, you know, within the same year that product's kind of dead. So we haven't seen that with Ryzen, but still, I mean, spending the kind of money you go from the 1700 to the 1800X is a bit crazy when you're not actually really securing anything extra. Now, if I made this a yearly feature, Nvidia's Titan product line would no doubt make the cut each and every year. Late last year, we got the mighty Titan X, and I'm of course talking about the Pascal version, not to be confused with the Maxwell Titan X from 2015. Anyway, the Pascal Titan X arrived late last year, and it was the biggest, baddest GPU Nvidia had on offer. Of course, as always, those that bought into the Titan Con got completely hosed just 3 months into 2017, and the GTX 1080 Ti arrived. Sure, it had 1GB shaved off the 12GB memory buffer, but with higher core and memory clock speeds, it was a faster product. The 1080 Ti also benefited from vastly superior add-in board partner coolers, making it much faster once overclocked, allowing all 3,584 CUDA cores to work much more efficiently. Despite the GTX 1080 Ti quickly putting down the Titan X, Nvidia came back for round 2 and released the Titan XP. Branded with the same insane $1,200 US asking price means that it's over 70% more expensive than existing 1080 Ti models. So what do you get for all that extra moolah? A 7% increase in CUDA cores and a teeny tiny increase in the VRAM capacity. Once again, the Titan XP can only be purchased with the Founders Edition cooler, and that is directly through Nvidia. So as a result, it runs hot and throttles under heavy load, so it's actually slower than custom 1080 Ti cards. At this point, gamers with deep pockets really ought to know better than to buy a Titan, but I'm sure there'll be those that still do anyway, just for the bragging rights. Though, it kind of has to be said at this point, it's getting more embarrassing than anything. Speaking of embarrassing, what about those new Star Wars Collector Edition models? Actually, I do have to admit those look pretty awesome. Still though, imagine if you were a huge Star Wars fan and you could afford stupidly expensive hardware, and just a few weeks prior to the announcement of this Collector's Edition model, you bought a Titan XP for $1,200 US. I wonder, what's the return policy on those, Nvidia? Surely you'd be absolutely spitting chips at the announcement of a $1,200 Collector's Edition Star Wars graphics card, but you've just bought the standard plain old Titan XP version. I suppose you guys are probably sitting there going, well, it's hard to have any sympathy for people who spend $1,200 on a Titan XP, But yeah, I suppose that's the life of a Titan owner. You just know it's only a matter of months, probably a month or two before you're going to get completely hosed. But I guess the fun part's finding out how. So 2017's been an exciting but also frustrating year for PC hardware. And although a few early adopters and those seeking bragging rights got a little burnt, there's been some great value options as well. Has to be said though, Intel probably pounded consumers the hardest, and much of that pounding could have been avoided if they just kept compatibility for their 8th gen core series with the previous 7th and 6th gen series. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Let me know if I missed any products or if you disagree with any of my choices or perhaps just have a bit of a different take on things. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon, guys.